Sorry, just give me a second. Perfect. I'll do the introduction again. Associate Professor Anitra Nelson is Honorary Principal Fellow at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. Prior to this, she worked at the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT, and she continues a collaboration with Professor Ralph Horn on low carbon inclusion. She's an activist scholar, and her current work focuses on social processes which are necessary for achieving environmental sustainability, post capitalism, and non monetary economies. Her most recent works include co editing a book called Food for Degrowth, which came out in 2021. In March, I believe, Anitra, is that right? In March of 2021, the book was released. And she also co-authored another book called Exploring Degrowth, which was released in 2020. And with that, Anitra, I would like to hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
That's good. Okay then. Now the other thing is I've got some slides and I sent you through a handout, and I don't know whether students have that and just want to refer to that as I go through the talk, or I haven't used Teams with doing a PowerPoint before, so I'd need some instructions.
If you would like, I can share your slides. I mean, both the options are possible. The students have it with them, so they could open it on their computer, or if you would like, I could share it on my screen, and you could do the talking. And if you tell me when to change the slide, I can do that for you.
Okay, then. So what I've sent you through, though, is a handout rather than the actual PowerPoint itself.
So would you like me to share that?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Yeah.
Just a moment. Yeah, can you see that?
Yep, I can see that. Okay. So what I'll do is that I'll just include the numbers that are under each of the slides, so everyone knows where I'm up to in terms of that. But they're fairly abstract anyway, and so I could still give the talk without them, but it sort of suits better if I have the slides there, okay? Okay then, so number one, in this talk, which is really more like an opinion piece or better, a wild lecture, I aim to provoke and to challenge you to rewild your logic. I need to give a warning. This talk might make you feel like I'm blasting the whole enterprise of rewilding out of the water. But I just want you to come on this journey with me. And then when the talk's finished, we can chat about constructive and informed responses to calls to and exercises of rewilding. 2, beyond being a researcher, I'm an arts practitioner. My book coming out next January is completely illustrated by me with black and white. I wrote a play which is based on material I found during my doctoral research, and I've made short films in the past and look forward to getting back into that later this year. I'm also an activist, so I'm really interested in talking in creative ways once the talk's done. 3, now, I do not set my challenges or provocations in the rising literature on wilding cities, but I do start with a quote from landscape architect Kevin Sloan, who defines rewilding as, quote, a landscape design and construction approach that reestablishes and or restores an area of land to an uncultivated state, unquote. But he makes numbers of qualifications pointing out that, quote, it is impractical, if not impossible, to re-establish a textbook example of an original landscape and its ecology, unquote. And there's the rub, as Shakespeare has Hamlet say in his to be or not to be speech. Sloane's qualification in and of itself calls into question the entire enterprise of rewilding and makes me think it might be better to say exactly what rewilding often boils down to. That is, to introduce urban features that are inspired by or remind us of the wild. In short, any act of rewilding runs the risk of being a simple design feature. 4. The definition of wild takes up 2 columns in my new shorter Oxford English Dictionary. There, wild is described as meaning to be in a natural state, uncultivated, free of human intervention, produced without domestication, uncivilized, and even barbarous. To be wild is to be unrestrained, willful, disorderly, irregular, irritated, and erratic. Describing an animal, it can mean game, as in wild duck or wild pig. With a plant, such as wild marjoram or wild parsley, wild refers specifically to being grown naturally without human assistance. Any wild item is almost invariably caught and dead, a corpse of wilderness that might be prepared for a dish, stuffed or pressed flat to preserve it, as in collections in 20th century museums. 5. In this perspective, it's impossible to bring the city and wilderness together. They are starkly different as black is to white. Indeed, the city is the antithesis of the wild. The city is ordered, clean, civilized, managed, cultivated, and its all too human animals are fenced, domesticated so as to obey traffic lights and to park within rectangular spaces in particular places for cars only, in going up escalators with lifts automatically carrying them in one direction to heaven or to hell, to arrive on time for work or lectures, and doing what they are told. It makes the daily news if a crocodile or tiger or snake is found on loose in a city. No, we don't want that, not real wild. The city is built of artificial building materials that resist mould, prevent sunlight, are waterproof, resist fire, and are strong enough that gale force winds or even earth trembles won't trouble them. There are all kinds of pest solutions, from mosquito, termite, and fly sprays to possum and rat and mouse traps. Ordinary people cannot build their own homes in these cities without all the materials being monitored and regulated by planners and builders who recommend specific materials that do not easily erode, so as to provide habitat for insects and animals to live alongside us. In the city, all the elements and dynamics of real wilderness and wildness have been eradicated. So the first question is, why might we want to rewild the city? 6. The cynical response is that as natural beings, we realise that we need nature. We need to feel the sun and experience light, have positive emotional responses to nature, which help our well-being and physical health. So this call for rewilding can be seen as quite selfish. Perversely, given global warming from increased carbon emissions from our own making, we actually need trees in cities to make them more inhabitable as the climate changes. We need to resensitise ourselves to pre-city water flows, because the deluges that we are now so at risk of are best managed by following laws and processes of nature we never managed to escape from. Things like gravity, thermodynamics, transpiration, and erosion. Others arguing for rewilding deplore our separation from nature and exhort us to understand that we are at one with nature, not apart from it. So, even if we live in urban environments, there are calls for reminding us that we are part of the wild and that the wild exists somewhere. A second question is, what might be the unintended, damaging, even disastrous effects of rewilding projects? 7. I can point to one which has existed for a couple of decades, the Melbourne Museum's Forest Project. Once upon a time, in my lifetime, but maybe not yours, the Melbourne Museum was located where we now find the State Library of Victoria. That was the 20th century. And in that century, museums usually held lots of dead stuff, including bones of Indigenous peoples that had been taken from them as if they were precious treasures. Walking into 20th century museums was like going into a mausoleum of nature, looking through glass at things that made you feel quite disgusted and disturbed. 8. But now we live in the 21st century, and we have 21st century museums like the Melbourne Museum, which, when it moved to its present location in the Carlton Gardens, established itself with a forest gallery, which its site describes as, and I quote, the living heart of the museum and home to tall trees and wondrous wildlife, unquote. You might say Melbourne Museum started rewilding before it became fashionable, but right from its beginning, which coincided with the time that I joined RMIT University as a postdoctoral fellow, I felt it was a distinctly artificial excuse for a forest. Number 9. That's partly because I was born in Hayfield in Gippsland, a town which in the 20th century more or less owed its existence to 3 timber mills processing trees mined from the magical East Gippsland forests, which we could just peek at on the horizon. Later, I would learn that these ecologically rich and biodiverse ecosystems stretching over 1 million hectares, had evolved in unique and internationally significant ways since around 65 million years ago when Australia broke out of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana. 10. Indeed, my postdoctoral research was on the conflict between environmental and monetary values in East Gippsland forests. Moreover, at that time, I lived at Round the Bend Conservation Cooperative in a box ironbark forest on the peri-urban fringe of Melbourne. Round the Bend was established 50 years ago, specifically to try and show that people could live in low-impact ways in a forest, nurturing and caring for it as it provided habitat for them. For all these reasons and more, I knew what forests were, and I used the past tense advisedly. 11. I was attracted to researching forests as a forest activist. By the 21st century, East Gippsland forests, which contain the largest contiguous regions of old growth and undisturbed forests in our state, supported more than 300 rare and threatened plant and animal species, with old growth forests providing habitat for the spot-tailed quoll, powerful owl, sooty owl, and the long-footed potteroo. These forests have been assessed by English botanist David Bellamy as, quote, the most diverse range of temperate forest ecosystems on Earth, unquote. But the integrity, indeed the very existence of such forests and all these animals and plants was and still is threatened by clearing, mainly clearing by so-called forest industries, but also for farming and settlement. 12. When Australia experienced its catastrophic 2019 to 2020 summer bushfires, it had already lost 2/5 of its forest cover since white settlement, at which time around 30% of the continent was covered by forests. Although fragmented and degraded through clearing, many of these forests had remained of international significance into this century. Still, much of the remaining forest was degraded and in fragments before the 2019-2020 fires that burned 20% of existing forests, breaking global records for forest devastation. The extent and intensity of the fires has been directly linked to anthropogenic climate change. Plants in complex forest ecosystems absorb and store carbon emissions, so that an estimated third of those in the carbon emissions are induced by human activities every year are actually absorbed by forests. This means that any forest degradation contributes to global warming. Equally, preserving current mature forests and halting deforestation worldwide would double the uptake of carbon from forests. Today, a key environmental challenge for Australians is regenerating the vast tracts of various tropical, subtropical, wet and dry temperate ecosystems destroyed and denuded in those massive bushfires. Worldwide, scientists are arguing for what they call pro-forestation as the best practice, along with only plantation wood to be grown for wood industries. 13. But here in Victoria, the forest wars continue, and the timber industries, so-called forest industries, say they know what they're doing and city folk wouldn't understand. So you might say, isn't it great to show people a fragment of forest in a city and then they'll love nature? Well, the problem is you can't have a fragment of forest any more than a fragment of you is you. Take your finger off, that's you? I don't think so. It gives the wrong impression of what a forest ecosystem is. Just like a finger can't stand for a human being or saving and nurturing a human life. 14. It reminds me of the equally disturbing and now commonplace misnomer of urban forests, which refer to tree plantings and revegetation of a distinctly cultivated kind. They're urban and they're not forests. And to talk about them as forests gives especially city children the wrong impression. A literally unreal concept of the rich composition of real wild forests. It makes it okay for people to, and for children to grow up thinking, yeah, forests are just a whole lot of trees, we can put some over there. Don't know what the protesters are on about. 15. In short, I think that Melbourne Museum's Forest Secrets is really something of a gimmick, a design feature, and a questionable educational tool. A real act of wilding would be to graffiti its glass casing in big red letters, "Beware, this is not a real wild forest." And if Melbourne Museum staff took that on board, great. It would make their exercise more genuine, less like tinsel, and more educational, because it might make urbanites think and even act to preserve Earth. 21st century museums pride themselves in being living museums, but this is a pot plant forest. It's a balcony forest. It's a contradiction in terms. It's some big trees in glass in the middle of a city at a point in history when cities are cancers on Earth. At least that's how many of our Aboriginal people speak about them. For me, the answer to environmental crises and climate catastrophe is a total change in our ways of thinking. We have exalted the city. We bring everything into the city, like a dog with a bone who decides they want to have and therefore bury hundreds of bones. A dog gone mad, not a wild dog, a mad dog. 16. We can rewild cities. It definitely would be better than nothing. If I lived in a city, I would rewild it in particular ways. For instance, I really love the idea of returning Elizabeth Street into a landscape that not simply references the river it once was, as in current improvements in this slide, but goes further, as Cliff Chang did in his article with Janet McGaw with a suite of ideas for not so much recovering as reinventing Williams Creek. Number 17, with a wetland and plumbing below the tram tracks and grass on the surface. 18, installing a headwater reservoir. 19, and vertical gardens. 20, even a waterfall, because Williams Creek used to drain into the Yarra River. But I'm still left with a disturbing sense that this very sensitive and highly creative set of interventions is so mechanical and so engineering that this feat is very artificial, and it becomes, again, a kind of apology to nature in as much as it celebrates more human ingenuity. My point in all this is that we could do so much more in the way of philosophically deeper rewilding. We should be decentralising. And now I go on to the last slide. We could be re-ruralising cities. So in my opinion, the only way for the human species right across the globe to become sustainable is to create settlements that are mainly locally self-sustaining, self-provisioning. And I would see this as rewilding ourselves. Visually, this is the way I see it. The city is white, wild is black. Yes, we need shades of grey, but we need black and white too. We need to be black and white. Let's not just do wild, let's be wild in our thinking. So now what I really like to do is to hear everyone else's thoughts about rewilding.
I just wanted to say that you bring up a really important point that rewilding today can sometimes be used not for the purpose of actually rewilding, but for the purpose of, masking the fact that these environments and habitats have been wiped out by giving us a glimpse of what they used to be. I think it's a really interesting point, and I actually hadn't addressed that in the past, so it's nice for you to bring that up, so I actually know that now and can consider that in any future work that I do.
Great. Yeah, well, I really love the idea of rewilding as, as I say, it's 10 times better than nothing. But then, especially with that whole having done so much work on forests and then knowing that a lot of city children even don't really know where milk comes because they've never seen cows or a farm, I thought, wow, a lot of what forests really are, unless you've actually been in one, and it's not a particularly regular experience, you don't actually really understand what all of those ecological values are. I was wondering if anyone had ideas about how to address some of these kinds of things. I know that certain people sort of argue that we should be living a lot more, like I'm involved with the degrowth movement, and a lot of people try and preserve old buildings and not worry about there being mold. But then there can be problems with people's health effects. So there's this incredible balance between what we actually do need in terms of being human beings with certain kind of sensitivities in terms of our health. But it seems to me that there are probably a lot of ways that our cities could be wilder if we didn't rip things down and redevelop things so much, but lived a lot more with older kind of materials. And I wondered whether people had been thinking about that in those directions with their projects.
So are you sort of suggesting, instead of like developing new things, we sort of work with the old and sort of build around what we already have?
Yeah, and maybe really highlight it. And I'm not sure about sort of the extent to which we can actually, now it's really good because we've got lots of bees in the city, but we could have other insects as well. I mean, I think there's probably lots of opportunities for there to be interdisciplinary research teams, you know, with students who'd be working in the sciences. And, you know, I know that some of the people, the academics in environment and planning doing these kinds of things, but yeah, for students working across the disciplines, so design, working with science students, and sort of working out how you could be reintegrating these kinds of things. And I do know that, you know, there's sort of like biomimicry and some of those kinds of ways of thinking about how we develop cities in the future, I think could be really interesting.
Also, the sheer population density of our cities, do you see that as an obstacle?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question completely. It's about, was it about population being?
Yep, the population density of our cities.
Yeah.
Incredibly high. Do you see that as like a big thing to work around?
Yes, look, I'm someone who's often argued, you know, that we should be prepared to have much denser cities, especially like I think that our suburbs have a lot of sustainability problems. I work with some colleagues at University of Melbourne, Sam Alexander and Brendan Gleeson, who've written a really fantastic book on degrowth in the suburbs, which is more taking up a permaculture approach to the suburbs, and rather than necessarily densifying them, but actually making them like food bowls. And I think that's a really good idea. That's really sort of going in a really useful direction in terms of sustainability. But one of the problems with just having more and more people who are living in the city, and it's a very big and serious direction that Melbourne is now taking about becoming a bigger and bigger city. The problem is that a lot of our lack of sustainability derives from the fact that we're moving everything in trucks, big vehicles. We're moving ourselves, even if you're using public transport. Long distances in Australia and even in our cities mean that if we're bringing in all of the things that city people need to consume, and they need to be cutting down, or a lot of people need to be cutting down, not everyone. A lot of the unsustainability is just simply due to moving things from place to place, as well as overconsumption. And so it's a problem because cities are cut off from, and people are also protected from understanding that they're using 4 Earths rather than, living within Earth's limits. And so I think cities are particularly artificial environments that don't remind you of what Earth's limits are. And I think that when you live in cities, you've automatically developed a big problem in terms of moving things from where they're grown. So that's why I argue that decentralisation would be a really good way forward and enable us to make more sustainable production and consumption and living for ourselves.
And I think, Anitra, I would also like to in that context say that in some ways COVID has helped us in realizing that we all don't really need to be in the city, in the center of everything happening. It's quite possible to be in the suburbs and yet be able to function as you would have if you were not in the city. So I think that idea of decentralization really resonates, and people are kind of, are more open to that now than they probably were in, let's say, 2018 or the beginning of 2019. So yeah, I think that kind of really it would really contribute towards rewilding in that sense.
Yeah, so rewilding might be putting some great big arrows on our highways saying forests this way, oceans that way, and go and live there. Yeah, I think the point is that we do have technologies which enable us to do a lot of these things. And what I'm finding, I live in central Victoria, in Castlemaine, and well, it's really bad for us in terms of housing because there's just now these massive house price rises, which sort of bring along all of its own problems, but definitely people moving to more central areas of the state, and I think that would be a much better way to go. I'd be really interested in hearing actually if students are sort of working on any projects that that raise completely different issues from this, and or had already integrated this into the ways that they were thinking or whatever. Yeah.
So I think your talk comes at a very good point in our 12 weeks of the course, because they've just started looking. They've been looking at literature, and they've been looking at case studies of rewilding. And just today, they've started working on identifying a site where they feel that there is an opportunity for rewilding. So we were just having a discussion with about, I think 3 groups had put up their sites. So one of the first group. Would you like to kind of describe what your site is like? Because they've got a big highway, it's like a super highway. And
terrific.
Yeah, so group 1, would you like to kind of tell Anitra about your site a bit?
Sure, yeah. So our site is basically a freeway exit and entrance, and underneath there's a big park. And so what we're going to focus on rewilding the area like underneath that like bridge, because it's a bit awkward in the park because it's like a big wide open space and then there's just this big bridge and like dirt underneath. Yeah.
That sounds fantastic. I really like a kind of edgy, showing the juxtaposition of that kind of image. Yeah, I think that's actually, that's gives you a lot of ideas and a lot of associations, and is clever because it, as I say, juxtaposes and some of the tensions between cities and wild and that kind of thing.
And in fact, when I was looking at the images that they were presenting, I was almost thinking to myself, what if they were to say that we want to get rid of this bridge completely? As an activist, you might even think of activist designer, I think we should call ourselves. We can even think on those lines. So, yeah. And then another group, they had the idea of, chunking. So every suburb would have, between residential plots, you would have like an empty plot that would just be kind of like an abandoned space. And it kind of repeats itself every few miles, I would say, or every few plots. So they are looking at it more in terms of, how it could be a scalable project where if you design one such site, can you do it across all of Melbourne or, the entire country, so to say. So I thought that was another interesting way of looking at how it could be a possibility.
I think that's really good because it actually fits in with current policies whereby every person is supposed to be within a certain distance from some green space. But I think it's actually, when you're thinking about rewilding and what you're thinking about what real wild is and that kind of thing, thinking about all the different kinds of spaces that you could have instead of these like passive park spaces, you know, that you can have spaces that might have some farming in them, some spaces that might have some real wildy kind of parts in them, and that they might be a little bit more dangerous and that kind of thing. But when I was brought up in the 1950s in Australia, you know, one of the things that people my age often think about is that, oh my God, poor young people nowadays, you know, they don't have the chance to kind of do a whole lot of dangerous things that, you know, we used to do because we were allowed to sort of hang around rivers and make sort of ropes hanging off them and swing on them and all of that kind of thing. And I think that, you know, that's why I kind of try and build up wilding being part of what we are. I think it's one of the real attractions to wilding. So how many projects are there?
There are 9 groups in total, groups of 2s mostly. So far we discussed only 3. Maybe each of the groups can, you know, you can, so group 1 already had a go. Team 2, would you like to have an interaction with Anitra?
Sorry, pardon, my internet dropped out. What was that?
Yeah, I was just saying, would you like to kind of describe your site to Anitra and see, you know, what are the possibilities or?
Oh yeah, for sure. So our site is like a section of Royal Park, and it's next to this other site that has been kept as a native site. And so our site has like some native plants, like there's some red gums and some native shrubbery and stuff, but like I don't really think they fill the potential in terms of like what they could do rewilding the native plants in there. So our project is kind of just around like getting more native plants in there, especially in the like open grassy areas, so just like those grassy fields, and encouraging bird life as well, because that's one of the aims of Royal Park. They want to try and bring back the bird life, and I think giving it like a wider area of like actually properly rewilded stuff would help encourage the bird life to come back. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really good. So would you be having lots of sort of like, would you have bird boxes and you'd have particular plants that are attracting particular kinds of birds?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And as well, there's on our site, there's like a sports center and like another building as well. And there's some roads. There's a road that goes through that has cars on it. So I don't know, I guess more research will need to be conducted, but like, how can we make those built human facilities have the least impact for the animals that are there? Because I think that's really important as well. Like if it's like, I don't know, maybe limiting times like that the road can be used, or like designing some features and stuff. But yeah.
So when I lived around the Bend Conservation Cooperative, which is in Christmas Hills, we did not have any pets whatsoever. But, you know, cats are the most destructive when it comes to birds. And one of the things that I noticed living there, living in an environment where there were not dogs, cats and horses and goats and those kinds of animals, but I think primarily the dogs and the cats are ones that frighten birds. I was amazed at how kind of tame birds were, that they'd actually come much closer to human beings, and it was fantastic. So yeah, I would see sort of keeping cats out as actually being something that would be really good to put some thought into. Might be hard because there's, you know, there are foxes and stuff. In Brunswick, when I lived in Brunswick, I saw foxes. Yeah. Which is kind of wild in itself.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's a really good. I didn't think about that because Royal Park, they do allow dogs. I think some parts leashes, some parts off leashes. But yeah, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's just so many things to think of. Lots of possums around too. Really interesting to think about how all these different animals interact with one another and that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Anitra, I was also wondering, when you talk about degrowth, if you could elaborate a bit more,
Sure.
because, I think it would be very interesting for the students to know a bit about how degrowth can actually affect, wilding or rewilding in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So I became involved in the degrowth movement sort of over 10 years ago. And primarily degrowth is challenging notions of growth. And the idea is both to limit the amount of materials and energy that we use for production and consumption and in our lifestyles, but it's also about reducing inequalities. So it's just as much about society and about human beings as it is, and about our practices, as it is about nature and respecting Earth's limits. So in the degrowth movement, I think that there are quite a lot of degrowth centres and activists who follow degrowth who would always go for retrofitting houses before anything else. And so I edited a book with Francois Schneider, who's French and lives in a degrowth centre on the edge of France and Catalonia in Spain. And so that's an occupied building. It's probably about 200 years old. And in our book, Housing for Degrowth, we had lots of different chapters. Some of them were about people building their own homes from small homes from scratch, because the whole idea with degrowth is that we live in as small spaces as that we can. And one of the ways that you can economize on space is actually by living in bigger groups. So there might be, it might be like co-housing. But other examples is that there's a chapter in our book that's by an Australian author. She lives in Copenhagen, in Christiania, and that was an occupied, disused army barracks. Some of the people there also built some new housing, but always out of recycled materials and things like that. So in terms of ways in which degrowth visions a better sort of world is by us just reducing as much as we can in terms of consuming things, and reducing the kinds of waste when we're producing things. Probably using very simple technologies, just because that means as many people can use those technologies as possible. And so sharing a lot of production and living more, I suppose, a little bit like older village lifestyles, but trying to be much less rich and poor. Like we've got lots of traditional kinds of societies where there's a big difference between rich and poor. And in degrowth, there's a very strong commitment to reducing inequalities, because richness is using up too much of the earth, and people who are poor are not getting actually enough. So it's all about kind of satisfying basic needs, just kind of enough is enough. In terms of rewilding, that's where the not having very simple technologies and actually working with nature is something that Degrowth is very, very strong on, because it saves us time. And yeah, so you could say it's anti-technology in certain ways, but it's really more about appropriate technology and using simple technologies. So really cutting down on any kind of vehicle use, using more bikes and public transport, that kind of thing, and having a much slower lifestyle. So you're really actually not having to move as much staff and people at all.
Yeah, thank you. That really makes a lot of sense, because I think as a class we've also been discussing about slow design, and how as industrial designers where do we come into the picture of saving nature. So whenever we talk about design, it's always everything really. What really is nature in today's time? Is there any nature that has been left untouched? All of it seems in some ways to be, like you said, human centered. And so also I think a lot of the philosophies or the theories around rewilding suggest that we should, instead of talking about human-centered design, we should be talking about humanist-centered design, which means that we give a voice to those who don't have a voice, for example, the animals. And when you talk about equality in degrowth, can we use that aspect of degrowth into rewilding and create something which is sustainable, not just for us as humans, but for the entire ecosystem. So I think what you said kind of really touches upon this aspect of looking into rewilding for us.
And the actually just looking at housing and the designs is really fascinating, because there's a guy who lives in Barcelona, and he actually lives in a squat, a very famous squat called Can Masdeo on the edge of Barcelona. But his PhD was on degrowth, and I can remember some of the designs that he had in his thesis of like very simple dwellings where people kept their sheep and their goats, their animals, under the house, and that provided warmth for the house as well. So using minimal amounts of actually using wood, but using just small amounts of wood and using that for all the cooking as well as heating the home. And the animals got the warmth from the house and gave warmth back, and it's appreciating nature that, there are all these co-benefits with being very close with nature like that. I think there are wonderful design sort of opportunities and creative exploration in all of these areas.
Absolutely. Would anybody like to ask Anitra questions or have comments for her? Or
I can tell you some other examples with the Housing for Degrowth book. There was an architect wrote one of the chapters on the work that she does in her architectural practice in Bangalore. Is it Bengaluru? It's
I think they've recently changed it to Bengaluru, but yes,
that's right. Yeah, that's right. And so she said that with the massive population increase in that city, they had literally leveled all the hills disappeared around the city, because they were just using all of the materials in the hills for creating bricks and and materials for the city and dwellings. So her partners and her, as well as builders, sat down and tried to work out some really good methods for actually building dwellings that would mean that wouldn't happen. And they've actually developed this really fascinating way of when they have just some cleared land, building down so that you have a basement and with the material that all the clay that's come out of the basement of a regular small home, they can actually get enough materials out of that for the bricks for the rest of the building, for 2 buildings, not just one. Okay, and then what they do is that they've got a basement which people ordinarily don't have, but is already kind of like at a very good moderate temperature and doesn't require heating and cooling and is used for all kinds of things. Then they have a couple of stories, and it includes solar panels and collecting water off the roof. So they're really looking at an almost off-grid kind of place, but right in the centre of the city, and using the materials that are around the city to actually build their homes. This is fantastic, you know, it's just wonderful sort of design principles that are being used in practice. And part of that too is that the builders that they use in their buildings find their work much more fulfilling than working for developers who are banging up concrete structures and very much just giving people piecework, and where they kind of feel quite exploited and they use a lot of machinery. But in these homes, the degrowth homes that the architect is building, they actually go much more back to craftspeople doing some of the work with mud brick styles, as well as some concrete bricks that they do in their own ovens there and stuff like that. So that's the appropriate technology approach, which is also trying to make our lives more fulfilling than they are when often people are looking at going into careers where there's a lot of machinery and technology involved, which is all using the earth, like a lot of our digital technologies, which we would, you know, a lot of degrowth people think that digital technologies are good, but we really should diminish our use of it and make sure that we don't keep on changing things so quickly that we're always trashing machines and moving on to the next kind of iteration of laptops and phones and that kind of thing, because they use rare earths. And rare earths are really, you know, like precious, but they're also dangerous. They're a little bit like uranium in terms of there being lots of toxic materials being unearthed. And then, you know, like, what do you do with these materials? Some of them you can recycle. But the European Commission recently has done a big study on, you know, how much you can recycle. And they've actually found that there's probably only about 16% of materials that you can actually recycle. So the idea of the circular economy is really a great idea, but it's kind of not going to happen unless we can do these kinds of things. And we have to think really seriously about them. And like, design is a fantastic perspective to be using to working out how we actually have more sustainable futures.
Yeah, and when you talk about appropriate technology, I think that really makes a lot of sense, because, you know, all of us think about the word industrialization as meaning progress, which may not necessarily be the case.
No.
So it is something that needs to be looked into, and yeah. Does anybody have any questions for Anitra? questions? Feeling shy?
Any more project material?
Sorry, I have a question.
Good.
So, when you talk about degrowth, I agree. It's very important to reduce our consumption. But I can imagine there's a lot of pushback against something like that. For example, if you suggest people eat less meat, you might encounter a lot of resistance. So, what are your views on that?
Yeah, of course, they're not just challenges for degrowth. A lot of sustainability movements, recognise that if people reduce their consumption of meat, it really help us overcome lots of problems. And it's not just meat, it's reduction in a whole lot of areas, because the growth, and this is why it's called degrowth, is that the whole growth economy is actually built on a whole culture of people having as many things available to them as possible and as much so-called freedom. But of course, as you know, like living within this kind of society, there's a lot of rationing occurs because there's a lot of inequality, and people either can't work or they don't get work that enough work, or the kinds of jobs that they do aren't paid well. So in terms of meat, I'll tell you what, in the degrowth movement, for instance, when we have conferences, we often have mainly vegetarian food. But I think that the approach is that there's no point in just kind of like banning things. We're very much into encouraging people. So encouraging people to love vegetarian food. So give people lots of vegetarian food, which is really beautiful and really nice. And also making people aware that that meat does just take up so much in the way of resources, agricultural resources. And yeah, I think that's kind of like mainly the approach with the meat. I'm vegetarian, and before I went to Round the Bend Conservation Cooperative, I lived in a place called Common Ground, and that was a big joint household, and everyone was vegetarian. Again, not banning it. Some people had meat in their fridges and stuff, but they wouldn't eat meat in public with people. And after a couple of years of living there, I actually just went off meat altogether. But I also know that certain people actually need meat because it has readily available supplies of iron in it. And for some people, biologically, that's the easiest way for them to actually remain healthy. So all of these things have just got, pros and cons. But definitely it would be great if a lot of people reduced the amount of meat that they had or ate. And I have to say, I feel really, I find it very challenging to think of all of the ideas about developing artificial meats. I like the idea of eating insects, but I don't like the idea of, someone kind of like growing meat in a bath or something. I think that's really weird.
Yeah, I think I've been a vegetarian all my life, and my husband, he eats everything. He urged me to try out some of these artificial meats, and no, I don't think it cuts it out at all. So yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Yeah. Great. Does anybody have a last question for Anitra? No, no more questions? Okay. All right then, great. That was wonderful, Anitra, and I think that was quite an eye-opener in that sense, because how we look at design and how we look at capitalism and industrialization and, you know, progress and all of that kind of, you know, made a lot of sense in what you said, because you spoke about science, you spoke about design, you spoke about politics, and of course the environment is the, I would say, the ultimate sufferer of all activity that is human induced. So I think what you said really resonated, because as designers there's a lot of opportunity for us to intervene in ways that can help us reduce our let's say the carbon footprint or the human footprint on this earth. So I think thank you so much for sharing your ideas and your thoughts with us. Really, really helped kind of take it into a different perspective. And I'm almost now tempted to tell all the designers that stop, there's nothing we should be doing. We should not be, you know, doing any design at all. But yeah, I suppose there's still a lot of time before that can be kind of taken into mainstream design.
I think it's just a matter of actually understanding that nature is just such a wonderful designer in and of itself, and therefore just blend in with that and work with it, because I think that's what works best.
Absolutely. Yeah. Totally agree with you on that, Anitra. Great. Thank you so much, Anitra. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for sharing your time and thoughts with us today. I hope all of us will get the time and we will make the effort to read your books. And I'm sure many of us will reach out to you with more questions. And
yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Welcome. I welcome questions. People can email me anytime. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Anitra. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.